Welcome everyone. This is yet another episode of Crypto Convos, and I am extremely excited today to have Admiral Mike Rodgers joining me for this one. Welcome.
Thanks, Vince. Pleasure to be here.
So for those of us, of those of you who don't know Admiral Rogers, you spent your life in the Navy, most well known for the fact that you at the same time were the commander of National Cyber Command, but also the director of the National Security Agency. And I find this amazing because effectively this is an overlap of people who are spies and people that are hackers at the same time. So they must be, that's one eclectic group to be managing, and then managing all of them.
An interesting group of men and women, highly motivated with an amazing set of capabilities, but culturally very, very interesting. And it was also an interesting dynamic of Cyber Command was a lot of military, NSA was a lot of civilian. So different cultures, as a leader, trying to manage all that, maximize the ability of the team. That was a lot of fun.
You certainly earned a reputation. So the first sort of topic I want to dive into is around sort of software bugs, and so we like to talk about cryptography here, right? But also in general, infrastructure related issues, and also cybersecurity. How do organizations deal with it? Things like that. Now, last week, we saw an announcement that OpenSSL had a bug. And it might be a critical bug, right? And
again,
OpenSSL, of course, again, right? Like it's Heartbleed all over again. Now, what I've seen, right? So this has hence been released. It's turned out to be a good vulnerability, but not a critical one. Something that certainly needs to be patched. But OpenSSL underlies so much the software that we see, throughout the industry, right? In your opinion, right? Like, how do organizations, what's the biggest challenge organizations have in dealing with something so core to their software stacks?
So man, I have lived this. In my previous life, as you said, as the director of NSA, as the commander of Cyber Command, I literally had been in my jobs for a week when Heartbleed happened. And now I'm tasked with, okay, Roger, so how is the Department of Defense going to respond to this vulnerability? So I took away a lot of lessons from that. So the first challenge I always thought was, SSL associated vulnerabilities are both significant in potential impact, but also in magnitude. They're so broadly dispersed. The first challenge was trying to identify among all of our users, among all of our network configurations, where exactly did the Heartbleed and now OpenSSL, where exactly does the vulnerability reside within our systems? I found the hardest part was trying to identify where does the vulnerability exist, because this capability is so widely deployed, so widely dispersed. And then secondly, it was trying to then deploy the fix. So Heartbleed, for example, we spent months. I mean, the Department of Defense is huge. It is a massive set of networks and capabilities at multiple classification levels, multiple different types of networks. But SSL is foundational to all of it. And so we found the vulnerability deployed across the breadth of our network structure. And then trying to identify, okay, so where does it exist? Who owns that particular part of the network, so to speak? And who's going to deploy the fix? And have we tested it to make sure it's in place? That got to be the heart. This got to be a huge tracking issue, just keeping track of it. And I suspect it'll be the same with OpenSSL.
Yeah, with the new bug. Yeah, so to me, it seems that when we talk about software vulnerabilities, right? So you're talking about the visibility of it, right? The difficulty here is if I say, okay, it's Apache. Well, then you go around, you're like, okay, where are my web servers running, right? You might have some reasonable level of inventory on that on an ITSM system or what have you. When it comes to library vulnerabilities, and cryptography is of course very much library driven, right? The developer includes it in their app. This can be like a next to impossible challenge to sort of scale, right? Like you don't have that vulnerability. You can't simply figure out where the vulnerability exists. Now, do you think, from an organizational level, the time that has passed, right, and the experiences we've had, we've gotten any better at it?
I don't know that we've gotten better in the sense that we intellectually acknowledge that this kind of scenario exists and we need to be prepared for it. So it's not just an intellectual exercise anymore. It actually has happened. But I tell you, vulnerabilities at this magnitude of scale, I mean, I can remember discussions at one point should we just do a rip and replace? Is this so broadly deployed? Is it so significant? We should maybe just look at a rip and replace option as opposed to patch or fielding a software upgrade that addresses the vulnerability. That's a really interesting scenario. It's expensive, but to your point, particularly in the encryption world, when you get into the libraries, at some point you start to have this dialogue about, well, maybe this is just a rip and replace scenario for us. By trying to figure out exactly where it exists in the library. Just assume it's broadly there and let's go for replacements.
Yeah, and I think we've seen this happen on not just cryptographic libraries. We've seen this happen across the board. And software bugs, I mean, it's always amazes me because we as a society have gotten very good at finding single points of failure and building dependable systems out of unreliable parts, right? The example of, right, nobody would build an aircraft that has just one altitude sensor. Like, you're going to figure out several ways to measure your altitude so that the pilot then has like multiple ways of determining roughly how high off the ground the plane is, right? When we look at our software stacks, this is just not the case, right? Like, what we see is that we trust one algorithm, one library, one certificate, one guy who has the certificate, right? Like, all the way, we built a chain of single points of failure, and we don't even have visibility where they exist, right? So we don't apply those engineering practices.
Although, Vince, I would say it's not unique to the software world. Now, the example you gave was aviation, where the identification of risk was so high that we knew that going in. It's one of my takeaways from Colonial Pipeline, for example. We have more significant points or single points of failure or degradation of service or capability in the physical world, just as in the software world, that we truly understand. I don't think what this highlights is our knowledge of our structures, whether they be software-based, whether they be hardware or firmware-based, our knowledge of our structures at an individual, whether it's an organization or an individual level, is definitely not where it needs to be.
I think what you're pointing out there is an area of great interest of study, at least of mine, because I think that as we have evolved technology, and this is obviously true for physical world systems as well, but me being a technologist, I have better visibility on that, right? In the old days, you build a piece of software. Then we went on and we said, okay, well, hang on a second, maybe we can separate the data presentation and data storage layer. And then the data storage layer could be optimized, right? They had databases, and databases were built upon libraries that did very specific indexing, right? And as we create levels of specialization, we also built on top of that a tower, right? I don't want to say like a house of cards, but we're depending upon underlying layers to be completely dependable, and we don't have a good visibility or methodology to assign a risk assessment to that. Like, what if this one component fails? What does that mean for the rest of the system?
I would agree. And you want to see an example of that? Look at Log4j. So a simple software functionality that we had literally cut and paste for 15 years that we assumed had no vulnerability. So it was widely deployed because it executed a basic function that we used as the source code in much more complex software programs. And yet we didn't realize that we had this foundational vulnerability, and it had been there for over a decade before we became aware of it. And it was globally deployed. Why? Because we're going, well, let's not rewrite this code. We've got existing code. It's a simple function. Hey, this is good to go. It is amazing. One of the things the last few years shows us is there's the world in many ways, both physical and virtual, is a little bit more fragile than perhaps we fully understood. Or put another way, we have created systems that were built around the idea of they were going to operate in a rather benign environment in which they would not be exploited or used as a target or threatened. And that clearly is not the case today.
You describe even the foundations of the simple TCP/IP protocol, right? Like, it was never people never even thought adversarial intent, right, would be used.
Exactly.
So let's shift to some. So we've talked now about single points of failure and software implementations, complex systems engineering, right? Like I think you raised interesting points there. You know, cryptographic algorithms are actually of great interest here, especially sort of because of your prior experiences. If we think about, right, if we think about algorithms as a whole, most people tend to trust cryptographic algorithms as like perfectly secure because they're based on math. Now, you know, we know though, and we have seen that, right, these algorithms that we use like RSA, Diffie-Hellman, they are mathematical problems that are easy to compute one way, right? Like for instance, a multiplication, but very, very hard to reverse, right? Like what numbers went into that multiplication? Most cryptographic algorithms that have some kind of public key or asymmetric key technology, you know, rely on that. Now, we have no mathematical proof that there isn't a trivial way to factor an integer, right? And so, you know, based on your background, I want to explore that a little bit, right? Like, is there a reason to distrust that? Is there a reason to completely trust the mathematics behind these algorithms?
So you talk about my background. Look, NSA, the National Security Agency, creates all the cryptography for all the classified systems in the U.S. government. So, you know, we work to identify, we use existing mathematical algorithms and approaches like elliptical curve. We developed our own. So this was an area that I spent a fair amount of time in my previous life. I mean, I grew to really appreciate Fields Award winners in the mathematical world, for example, because they are amazing what they can do. Math, NSA is an organization that thinks math is sexy. So I used to tell mathematicians that we would try to recruit, hey, look, you're coming to an organization that thinks you're the cutting edge, that really loves what you do. So the algorithm work to me was a little bit like the software challenge that we talked about, where we spent a lot of time up front trying to make sure that it is mathematically sound. And then we try to understand the potential vulnerabilities. And then broadly, in my experience, once we make the judgment that it's mathematically sound and that it does not appear to have vulnerability, it's like we then adopt it as a standard and we assume, well, don't worry, it's never going to be exploited in any way. And, you know, in my previous life, we penetrated and defended systems. So in penetrating systems, one of the things we used to look at would be, could we overcome the encryption? Is there a vulnerability or a weakness, either in the encryption itself or in the way that it's applied? And to be honest, the biggest advantage at times we found was cryptography wasn't always uniformly applied or applied well in the way that the network owner thought it was. So you could sometimes find vulnerabilities in the actual methodology of execution and use. With respect to the mathematics itself, occasionally you might become aware of a potential vulnerability that you would then work to try to address. But the more common methodology in terms of an actor trying to penetrate is, can you find an error in the actual implementation as opposed to
the areas around the math,
as opposed to the core encryption and the mathematical computations and formulations themselves.
Now there is potentially a change of foot there though, because right, we obviously work in post quantum cryptographic you know, technology and ways to manage that. We have seen brilliant mathematicians work on algorithms that are you know, cannot be defeated by Shor's algorithm. The difficulty with this, however, is that most of the mathematics that these are based on have not been around for 2,000 years, right? Like it's very new mathematics. We've seen defeats, right? We've already, and we've talked about these in prior podcasts. I don't want to hash that out. Now, it is not unlikely, statement I'm making, that we will see additional defeats at the mathematical level of these algorithms. Now, when I am a CIO, CISO, right, director, you know, NSA, how do we deal with that organizational challenge? Because I can't sort of now pick one horse to, you know, one horse in the race, right?
Yeah, right. So you start to get to, can we look at resiliency and redundancy from a cryptographic perspective? So do I want to potentially look at, do I use multiple standards? Do I look at how long do I continue to use the same cryptographic approach? You know, traditionally, most people tend to take encryption for granted, and they just, whatever they have, they tend to use for a long, long time until somebody tells them, hey, it's unsafe, you can't use it, or we're going to replace it. In the organizations that I was a part of, one of the things we used to talk about is, do we need to take a look at a different approach? Should we more aggressively manage the way we use different cryptographic capabilities and standards? Should we look at multiple standards simultaneously? Should we look at replacement? It's some regular recurring activity. Now, you didn't do it every year. On the other hand, I can remember discussions about, are you comfortable using the same cryptographic standard for 15 years? You know, given the nature of the world around us, does that make you comfortable? We generally had a replacement program. We were not an advocate for extended, decade plus uses, for example.
And it makes sense. I think that the thing that I'm missing, or what I'm struggling with, is that we live in a patch and update culture, right? Like, if you want to replace, right, there's no sort of governance plane for that. This is not like software defined networking, right? This is very much and of course you had a very deliberate, thinking around that, which perhaps left the processes and responsibilities and timelines for that. I think and correct me if I'm wrong, I think that in most enterprises, this level of governance is simply lacking.
Yeah, it's not there. I'd be the first to admit it's not there. Encryption is very much taken for granted to me in most organizations. And I'm not arguing it's because organizations are short-sighted. It's because knowledge of it is very specialized. And it has tended to be an area that security to me is taken for granted. Once you get the NIST validation, then generally it's okay, so it's good to go. And I'm like, guys, we don't take that approach in software. Why should we take that approach in encryption?
Yeah. So let's shift tracks a little bit to risks to cryptography specifically, right? So you've already alluded to the fact, look, code breaking is absolutely part of what, and it's near to the heart of any nation wanting to collect intelligence, and it is also very much, right, like, if you can understand and eavesdrop on even your friends, I suppose, at least you have you can see it coming, right, when they turn their back on you. So this has been part of warfare for as long as warfare has existed. Obviously, intelligence gathering. Other nations are known to be doing this as well. How concerned, or what keeps you up at night around that? Like is cryptography truly an area that is of concern in that, and is it under attack by the adversary?
So it's not that I'm uncomfortable with where we are with encryption. Yes, it is an area where I've watched adversaries attempt to generate deep knowledge with a view that knowledge will lead to identification of vulnerability. My biggest concern is it tends to be something we take for granted. And because most organizations, as we've said, don't have in-depth knowledge, don't have people necessarily who are familiar with it, it just tends to be taken for granted. And so that many organizations count on an external entity to warn them or tell them there's something they need to be concerned about. That always worried me. The other thing that's really interesting, you're seeing this particularly with the Chinese. You're watching massive collection of data, to include encrypted data, with the idea that, hey, I may not be able to access it right now, but perhaps over time I will. And in so doing that, in breaking the encryption and accessing the data, I will generate insight and knowledge from the past that is relevant to me today. Boy, you never saw that 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I never saw data harvesting strategies built around the idea of collect as much as you can because we may be able to break it in the future.
I think the harvesting attacks is something we often hear about, right? And the point is that people typically think about, okay, the quantum computer or the algorithm, but in reality, the harvesting attacks are effective because at some point you get your hands on an account, you find a public key, right? Somebody had a web server and the key expired, right? And so now nobody watches the thing anymore, right? Like most organizations out there have some capability for break and inspect, right? Meaning there's some certificate floating around in the organization that's, used to create proxy search for and intercept effectively any communication inside that organization, right? Like all these capabilities will allow an adversary to decrypt, traffic that was prior captured, right? So I think this attack is actually very real, and I think that's what you're saying.
It is, and you see this, for example, harvesting of credentials.
Yeah.
Hey, look, for a variety of reasons, I'll be able to access this over time, and perhaps the user is using default credential settings, for example. I don't even realize, and if I can harvest this, I can use this for access, and the owner won't even be aware of it.
Yeah, this is so the protecting from that as a matter of strategy, right? Like as a matter of policy, it's always so difficult because if you look at the chief risk officer in any organization, right? What are they worried about? Well, I don't want people to click on the ransomware links, right? When it comes to true organizational risk, the eavesdropping risk is not a loud risk, right? An eavesdropping risk, in the moment I can read your data, I'm going to be very quiet about it because I can read your data, right? Like I don't need to do anything anymore. I don't need a ransom, right? And so it's very easy to underestimate this as a, as a risk.
And I think that's being done. I think it's not only easy, but the reality is I think that's a reality out there in many cases, not all, in many cases.
Yeah. So I want to be cognizant of time, but I do have a few other questions that that would love to ask. I'll ask them. Obviously, the information warfare, right? The proverbial fifth domain has grown significantly in the last 2 decades. So you're an instrumental part of raising the awareness on this. Now, obviously, we all think about information warfare as critical infrastructure. We think about attacks against power plants, water supplies, what have you. We have seen, for instance, the SolarWinds supply chain attack, right? Which was in many ways devastating, but the trains were still running and there was still food on the shelves. Given the capabilities, or given our trust in these technological systems and these automated systems, the potential for devastation is I would say very real. In your judgment, we haven't seen this. In your judgment, is the adversary keeping powder dry, or are we just that good at defending ourselves?
Look, the reality is what makes supply chain attacks so significant is the adversary is actually using the very security construct of the internet itself as the vehicle to achieve their desired outcome, penetration of a system for a potential wide variety of activities. They take advantage of the fact, look, we created an architecture that constantly opens itself up to software updates because we think those updates enhance security, enhance productivity, enhance functionality. So we built the system so that it opens up to allow the traffic, the passage of this. Adversaries are aware of that, so they thought, hey, how do we exploit that? How do we take advantage of that design characteristic, that what is now in some ways become a potential vulnerability? The fact that it is so foundational to the construct of the World Wide Web itself means that the impact of supply chain attacks can be fairly broad. The greatest cyber event, arguably globally, not Petya, was a supply-ware attack, originally focused against Ukraine infrastructure, but ultimately, because of the methodology and the tax software they chose to use to do it, found itself broadly deployed all over the world with a vulnerability that took, depending on where you were, hours, days, weeks, months to correct. It's had the longest duration probably, and it had the greatest proliferation. That's what makes supply chain vulnerability so interesting, so challenging in many ways.
And potentially so devastating
and so
as well now.
Right.
Yeah. And when we look at major cyber attacks, right? Like in many ways, physical kinetic warfare is easily or relatively easily attributable. When we look at cyber warfare, there's a level of anonymity, right? And in this case, like espionage and sabotage are close cousins because you have to get into the system in order to do either. Generally, we do see in the news attribution of hacking groups to state-sponsored activity, right? Which is, well, one could argue an act of war, but it's always hard to prove. It's not certain. Combine these two things, right? Devastating cyber attack, whether supply chain or not, with a correct attribution to a nation state actor, right? Are we running a risk, in your opinion, that might spill over in a sort of a larger geopolitical debacle at some point?
I mean, clearly it could. I will say, look, if you look the last 10 years, the ability to attribute cyber activity to specific actors with high confidence level has steadily improved over time. Not arguing it's perfect, but broadly, boy, probably 80% of the time, 90% of the time, you've seen the ability to attribute with high confidence. And so now that changes over time. I acknowledge, it's we get better than the adversary gets stronger and changes the way they work to try to obfuscate. Attribution was less the hardest thing to me. And quite frankly, the harder thing was the policy choice as a result of the attribution. And that's where the nation state, that's where geopolitics starts to be really complicated.
That attribution rate is actually much higher than I would have guessed. And I think that
I would say 80% generally.
Yeah, wow. That amazing, right? And having in my earlier career done malware analysis, right? You do start to pick up patterns, right? Like you can see coding styles, you can see things like that. So I'll take the number, but that's amazing. I hope certainly that by itself is a deterrent factor, right? For potential adversariness. So let's see if we can wrap it up a bit. I want to ask one more question, right? We've talked about
take us home. Time for the
take
big
us home. Okay.
Take us home, baby.
Well, it's your answers as I'm looking for. So we've talked about software bugs, we've talked about cryptography algorithms, we've talked about weaknesses in software, we've talked about patch and update culture, we've talked about complexity in systems, and we've talked about an inability to get a good handle on where these complexities are arising and what the vulnerabilities are subsequently from that, right? Essentially, we've laid out some of my most favorite topics in cybersecurity, and certainly, most of my soapboxes passed the review, so I'm pretty honored by that. How does a CIO or CISO manage these various risks, right? There's no absolutes in cybersecurity. So what is the approach? What would you say can one do?
So for me, it's number one, make sure you have an accurate understanding of your systems, their structure, your connectivity, and your software and your hardware. I am amazed at how many network owners don't truly understand their own systems. Put another way, literally in every case, when I was part of NSA or Cyber Command, and we provided capability to the private sector to help them address a penetration, what they showed us in terms of their network configuration, what we actually saw when we got in and scanned, was totally different. So I'm always amazed, guys. It starts with the fundamentals. Know your own structure. Know your own software. The second thing to me is, look, you got to take a risk-based approach to all this. If you treat everything the same, you get nowhere. And you also got to realize you got a fundamental mismatch between requirements, whether they be people, capacity, knowledge. In my experience, there's always going to be a shortfall between what you believe you need and what you have. Therefore, not only risk, but prioritization becomes everything. And then lastly, look, you're not in this alone. So ask yourself, who are the partners out there who can help me? Are there other companies within my own sector? Are there elements within the government or law enforcement, for example, that I can tap their expertise? How can I learn from others of similar size or similar sector or similar network construction? And, so many times we think as a CIO or a CISO, hey, we're all alone in this. It's up to us to just do it ourselves. And I'm like, look, that's not the approach to take here, I don't think.
I think those are valuable words. And I like you actually, your number one point was one of understanding and visibility. And I think, right, so I've spent many years in building cyber hunt teams, and it's right, like it's the trope of security through visibility that and it's so hard to grasp because you walk the trade show floor at RSA, what do you buy, right? It's always easier to justify the next detection piece of logic, but to say, let's take some really good people, enable them with the visibility they need so we can understand our unique terrain, right? Like everyone's network is a unique battlefield, if you will, right? And only if you watch it carefully and understand what that terrain looks like can you make a decision on where you need to build the next bridge or where you need to build the next wall, right? And so I'm really glad you sort of you closed on that. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed this conversation.
No, Vince, thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, I love the time to talk about encryption. Not many people do. I'm one of those sick individuals. I actually enjoyed that part of my previous life.
All right. Well, excellent. Well, thank you, and also thank you for your contributions, to the world as a whole, really. And also thank you to our listeners for joining us. And see you again in one of our next Crypto Convos. Thank you so much.